Здравствуйте, вы на канале Орталент, и сегодня мы берем интервью у антрополога из Дании. So, hello, could you please introduce yourself first?
So my name is Rune Steenberg. I'm an
Mhm.
anthropologist. I've been working on Central Asia and including the Uyghur regions since 2007. And I've also been working on Central Asia more generally and Central Asia's relation to China.
Mhm. Is it your first time visiting our country?
No, I've been coming here to Kyrgyzstan quite often.
Great. And how do you feel about Kyrgyzstan? Maybe about traditions, culture, maybe something different from other Central Asian countries?
I think Kyrgyzstan's a fascinating country. I really like coming here. I notice when I cross the border from both from China, when I've done that, I've crossed the border from China into Kyrgyzstan, but also now when I cross from Kazakhstan into Kyrgyzstan, I have a feeling kind of coming home.
Oh,
Maybe because Kyrgyzstan was the first country in Central Asia I came to, but I've also had a lot of really good experiences here. I think Kyrgyzstan is special in the sense that it's a landlocked, mountainous country with a long tradition of both nomadic and settled cultures, especially in the south, of course, the settled in the Fergana Valley, and it has a very interesting, more recent history as well, with it being made sort of the model for transformation or transition from the Soviet system to a modern capitalist system. And then with all the things that are connected to that, all the things that basically didn't work and that did work, and the political history of three revolutions, or
yeah.
four, I think you could say, including the last one,
Yes.
within its time of independence, and also a lot of interesting economic features, including the Kumtor gold mine, but also being a retransport hub for Chinese goods coming here. And then being sent further on to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even further into Russia, Iran, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in Kyrgyzstan and a lot of developments. I have the feeling things change very quickly. And I'm glad to be back here now and to kind of have the finger on the pulse a little bit again.
Okay. Now I feel like I know nothing about my country because it told a lot of interesting things. So yeah, actually you did a lot of good researches based on Central Asia, and would like to ask some questions such as how superpowers like Russia, China divided Turkestan area.
So what we today call superpowers is a quite new invention. I also don't know if I would call Russia a superpower. I might not even call China a superpower, though it's on its way to getting there. But what these two countries were definitely several hundred years ago, like almost all of the European countries, including my own, were colonial powers. And the way Central Asia looks today has been shaped in great part by colonialism, as has most of the globe, actually. But the special thing about Central Asia is that whereas most of the rest of the world was colonized by European countries that we today see as being part of the West, Central Asia was colonized by two main powers, which were the Russian Empire and the Qing Empire, the last Chinese dynasty. What we today know as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, also called East Turkestan, or the Uyghur regions, was conquered by the Qing army in 1759. This is 100 years before the Russian Empire conquered and colonized Central Asia. So you could say that Xinjiang or East Turkestan became the first colony in the time of colonialism of Central Asia. And then followed the conquest first of, parts of Kazakhstan. What's today Kazakhstan were also already conquered then, but it was especially in the 19th century, so about 100 years later, that the Russian army went into Central Asia and conquered the rest, including what is today known as Kyrgyzstan. And as we know from Western history writing, there were these conquests between colonial powers about land. And what is very well known to us is the so-called Great Game between Russia and the British Empire. That was played especially around Afghanistan. Actually, Afghanistan, as it exists today, is a creation of these two big powers wanting a buffer state between them. So wanting an area between them that's neutral so they wouldn't clash directly. And this is how Afghanistan was created, in this competition between the Russian Empire and the British Empire about land in, you could call it, in South Asia or in the northern part of South Asia, what is today Pakistan, Afghanistan, and goes into Central Asia. But at the same time, there was also power competition between the Qing Empire and the Russian Empire. And Central Asia was in the middle of that. And Central Asia basically was divided up between these two powers. And the land border we have between Central Asia, or the former Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China today, is a land border that was created at this time. And in part, it is a very high mountainous border that kind of makes a natural cut between them. But culturally speaking, socially speaking, in the sense of society and peoples, there was nothing natural about that border.
Now you told us about the history of all these processes, and what do you think, what is China's moves toward Central Asia countries today?
So China has had an interesting history in interacting with what we today know as Central Asia. Back in the 18th and 19th century, there were attempts of the Chinese to push their power and influence further into Central Asia, but it never really materialized. And instead, because back then East Turkestan, or what the Chinese then called Xiyu, the western regions, was quite weakly governed and weakly controlled by the Chinese. So there were actually, to the contrary, attacks from the Fergana Valley into the Qing Empire, into what is today especially the Kashgar region. In 1864, a returning commander whose family had come from the Kashgar region, but who had moved to Fergana, fled the Qing conquest, and now was returning with an army. He managed to conquer a big part of the region and turn it into an independent Islamic state for about 10 years before the Qing then reconquered the area. And after the Russians had established their rule in Central Asia, there were several negotiations and agreements between China and Russia about trade, about people moving back and forth over the border. And when the Soviet Union was established in the 1920s, they started to influence the Chinese part of Central Asia, which is today Xinjiang or East Turkestan, a lot. And throughout the whole so-called Republican period, so after the Chinese Revolution in 1911 and up until the communists took over in 1949, the region that we today know as Xinjiang or East Turkestan was very much influenced, and to a quite large degree even controlled by the Soviet Union and by Soviet influences. And then from 1949, after the communists took over, the Soviet influence went down a little bit. There was still a lot of exchange across the borders, people moving back and forth. And the Soviet Union also supported and helped the People's Republic of China, so that it's Communist China, to get set up until 1962. And in 1962, the relations between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China soured, and it came to the so-called Sino-Soviet split. So the two countries started to no longer see each other as friends and allies, but as competitors and enemies. Maybe they had already before, but now it became manifest and clear and out in the open. And in the years before 1962 and in 1962, in the beginning of 1962 itself, a lot of people fled from Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region, into the Soviet Union. As many as 200,000 people might have fled just in those few months of early 1962. And a big part of the Uyghurs, but also many, many Kazakhs and quite a few Kyrgyz also, who live in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan today, are descendants of these people who came across the border up to 1962. Then there was a period of very little interaction and almost no one crossing the border between the two countries. And after the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991 and the independent republics were established, the independent Central Asian republics, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth, people started again to be able to cross the border. There had been a little bit of that in the 80s already, because China was also engaging in reform policies under Deng Xiaoping from the early 1980s. But especially in the 90s, Kazakh, Uyghurs, and Kyrgyz started to come to Central Asia, mainly for trade and business. They didn't really move so much anymore, because by this time, the Chinese side had been more well developed than the Soviet side, and especially in the 90s, after the Soviet Union broke down, infrastructure, job, health, and so on all deteriorated in Central Asia. It was a time of collapse in many ways. So people from China at that point, even Uyghurs, were not really so interested in moving over here, but they were interested in coming here to trade. And in the 90s and 2010s, the trade went up. It grew a lot between Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or East Turkestan, and the Central Asian republics. And in Kyrgyzstan, there were even several big bazaars established that were specialized in Chinese goods. One of them in Karasu, that became the big re-export bazaar. For a while, the biggest bazaar in Central Asia, where Chinese goods would come in over Irkistan or Torgat borders with the southern part of Xinjiang or East Turkestan into the southern part of Kyrgyzstan, and then be sold on to especially Uzbekistan, but also beyond that. And in the north, Dordoy Bazaar near Bishkek was established, and also became a re-export bazaar for goods coming in over the Torgat Pass mainly, but also through Khorgos in Kazakhstan and through Almaty to Dordoy, and from there then would be sold on either also into Kazakhstan or into Russia and so on and so forth. And during this time, China started to establish a foothold in Central Asia. Central Asia became a place of Chinese influence. All of a sudden, it was very profitable to learn Chinese. I have many friends here and also in Osh who went to Chinese language courses because they would go back and forth and trade. And this continued up until the early 2010s, also with Chinese, Kyrgyz, Chinese, Kazakh relations being quite close. And actually, Xi Jinping, when he announced his Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, he did it at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. In 2010, in the mid 2010s, around 2013-14, the trade started to decline. That had several reasons, one of them being the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis also caused the Chinese economy to change, because Up until then, they were doing mainly export. Now they had to find a different way of growing their economy. And they started to change into surveillance technology, AI, these kind of things, and started to build up more of a base in their own economy. And that also affected the trade with Central Asia. The demand went down because people and countries were just poorer now, couldn't buy as much as before. And the change in the Chinese economy also meant that there was less going across these borders. Also, Kyrgyzstan joined the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia. And this meant that whereas before many of the goods coming from China had just crossed the border without any kind of tax or tariffs or anything like that, mainly through corruption or people just looking to the other side because it was in the interest of Kyrgyzstan to import so many things. You can see in the import-export statistics, if you compare how much China exported to Kyrgyzstan according to their own numbers and how much Kyrgyzstan imported from China, the imports from China was like 10 times below the exports from China to Kyrgyzstan. So that's of course good that is going across, but it's not being registered on this side. So it was very cheap. This changed with the European Eurasian Economic Union being established and Kyrgyzstan being part of it. And then from 2014 on, the situation in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, East Turkestan, started to change quite drastically. And the securitization that we saw there effectively meant that people were going across the border a lot less, that the local economy of East Turkestan deteriorated, broke down basically, and there was a lot less trade between China and Central Asia. But at the same time, China was pushing for the Belt and Road Initiative, and they were building infrastructure in Central Asia. And I think there was a decline in relations between China and Central Asia around this time, 2014 till maybe 2018 or something like that. But in the last few years, it's been picking up again. And in the early 2010s and the late 2000s, the relations between Kyrgyzstan and China were very strong, also economically strong. And now it seems to be kind of going back towards the same level. And I think one of the reasons for that is also that the West has retreated from Central Asia. In the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of engagement from the West with Central Asia. Since especially 2010, so the second Kyrgyz revolution, already 2005 with the first Kyrgyz revolution when Akayev was ousted and Bakiev came in, and then 2010 when Bakiev was also ousted, and there were the violence against Uzbeks in Osh. The West started to retreat. The war in Afghanistan going terribly wrong for the US and for its Western allies. The interest in Central Asia became less and less, and they started to pull out. And with the West pulling out, they opened up a void to be filled. And Russia was not able to fill that economically. In the sense of military and in the sense of security, they were. I would say this is no longer the case. But they were able to fill that for a while, but economically, in the sense of investment, infrastructure, and so on, China started to play a bigger and bigger role. And right now, too, with the Western powers not really interested in Central Asia and not really investing in it, the space, and now through the war against the Ukraine, Russia declining also, especially economically, but also diplomatically, politically, in many other ways. The road is paved for China to play a bigger role in Central Asia.
You told us a lot about China's moves toward Central Asia, and now what are the ambitions of China to Central Asia? Maybe strategies, ambitions.
But it's always difficult to say anything about Chinese strategies and ambitions because they're so opaque. They're not transparent about what it is that they're trying to do and what they want. And even if they were, like so many other countries, we also know what people say or what countries say on the outside that they want to do: develop other countries, make the world a better place, is often not exactly what they really want to do. So what I think China is looking for in Central Asia is to expand its sphere of influence. China is now becoming on par with the US in economic power. And in a capitalist world, in a capitalist system, economic power translates into political power. Next to military power, where of course they're not nearly close to the US, but they're also stocking up a lot. So China has come onto the global scene as the second largest power. And as such, they are trying to establish their sphere of influence, like the US has done it in Central America and South America, and in many other places, like Europe is also trying to do. China is trying to establish its backyard as its sphere of influence. And Central Asia is part of that, bordering up to China. So that is one thing that they are definitely looking to do here. Secondly, they are looking to use Central Asia and across that, the land bridge across Europe, as a place for investment, to get its capital out to work and get returns. Because in the last 20 years, a lot of capital has been accumulated in China. And the logic of capital in such a system, in the world economic system, is that you need to put it out to make it work, to get rent from whatever it's doing, to get profits from it. And that's what they're doing right now with the Belt and Road Initiative. They are investing, they're sending their capital abroad, they're lending it to countries like Kyrgyzstan with high interest rates, and they are going to make that create profit in China over the long term, which will lead to infrastructure being built here and people profiting from it, but it will also lead to Kyrgyzstan becoming more and more indebted to China and having to pay it back with interest, which means that you and all of your friends who will be working and paying taxes in Kyrgyzstan are going to pay this back to China over a longer period of time. Then China also wants to establish markets, I think, in Central Asia, and it wants to have geopolitical allies. So it wants to use the leverage it gains from its economic power to convert it into political power, to make the countries of Central Asia follow its lead and do as they say, basically, including suppress Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities from China who come over here, who could establish some kind of resistance against China, or just talk about the Chinese human rights violations that take place in the region. And the more power China has over the Central Asian governments, the more it's able to use these governments and their police force to suppress this kind of activity and activism and so on. And we see that, especially in Kazakhstan, rising at the moment, and also with Kazakhstan signing a lot of agreements with China about information exchange, but also the Kazakh police and secret service clamping down and going against any kind of dissent, China critical approaches in its population. We see it a little less in Kyrgyzstan, but also rising. And there's also, I think, a reason to fear that it will become stronger and stronger over the coming years. Of course, it also goes together with a general move across the globe towards more authoritarianism and away from democratic ideals. The hope that the West had in the 90s of the change, the wind of change, the move away from communistic autocracies towards democratic capitalistic societies didn't work out the way they had hoped for. I think in part due to the West's own mistakes and the West's own greed, being focused on creating profit for themselves and holding on to the asymmetric power relations that had been established through colonialism into the 21st century. And I think that was in part a reason for the democracy not actually being spread across the world, but also the global financial crisis. So basically the problems in the capitalist system and the problems especially with the phenomena of financialization, where finance became very important in generating growth and at some point led to bubbles that would collapse, has led to a situation where authoritarianism is growing, and unfortunately that's also the case in Central Asia.
Can we consider China as a threat for Central Asian countries, as many people nowadays think?
Well, I think China is plays a role and is a factor that can cause growth and economic benefits in the Central Asian countries, at the same time can cause a further decline of democratic values and a further decline of sort of free liberal social order. So it has several sides. I don't think China is a threat in the sense of threatening the countries as such, that is going to come and conquer them or take them over or buy them up or something like that. I think that's wildly exaggerated. China is playing along the same types of strategies and rules as the Western countries did in the 80s and 90s, exerting its economic influence, turning it into political influence and pressure. Well, I think the Western countries never really did much to establish democracy in other countries, but at least they said they wanted to, and they created some programs that put these ideas into people's heads. But the Chinese don't do that. Quite to the contrary, they're very happy with supporting strong authoritarian leaders because they will be able to personally and their families profit and benefit from the Chinese investments, and so they will not stand in the way of what China wants to do. They're much easier to control and deal with than the population. And we see that in Central Asia, that the attitudes towards China are much more positive in the power elite and even the economic elites, and much less positive in the population more generally. So I think China is a factor that is taking Central Asia in a direction that I am not very happy with, and that I don't think will serve the region well in the future. But I can also see that China is offering a lot of economic support, a lot of infrastructural support that is necessary here. I think a really good solution is not to be found within the existing system. I think we probably need to think a little bit outside of the box of established categories and see the possibility of a world economic system where Central Asia is not as marginalized as it is now, where it's not as exploited as it is now, where it gets more of a fair share. And that's a system that China is not bringing about, but it's also a system that the West has not brought about in the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, we don't really see any of the big powers pushing in that direction at all at the moment.
Also, there is a question about concentration camps in China. And is it true? And do we have any evidence for it? Maybe you held some researches on this topic, so
yes,
would like to know about it more.
So whether you want to call them concentration camps or not is something that I think is down to either your theoretical approach or your political approach. But the fact that from 2017 and to 2020, there was an extreme and illegal mass incarceration of minoritized people in the region, that is a well-established fact. They were incarcerated, locked up in different forms of facilities, and there are three main facilities, one being pre-trial detention centers, the second being the so-called re-education camps, and the third being prisons. And in a very vast and complex network of these camps, around 1 to possibly 2 million people were arrested, locked up, kept in detention, some only for a few weeks, some for a month, some for years. And in that period were interrogated, including torture for many of them, were beaten, were mistreated, many didn't have enough to eat, and they were indoctrinated with political content according to the party's ideology. Some were sent to work, forced labor, and some were sentenced to long prison sentences. Others were kept in camps and then released again. Most of this camp situation, the re-education camps and the mass incarceration in the re-education camps took place between 2017 and 2020. By 2020, the vast majority of people had been released from the so-called re-education camps, but not from the prisons. People are still, till today, in vast numbers in the prisons and in the prison system. Some people have been sentenced to very long prison sentences for something that you and I would consider nothing. So people have been sentenced for praying at home. They've been sentenced for having the Quran on their bookshelf. They've been sentenced for growing a beard. They've been sentenced for covering their hair with a headscarf. They've been sentenced for learning the Quran at a private Quran school 20 or 30 years ago. And these people are then sentenced to 10, 20 years in prison for extremism, which of course it is not by no definition in any reasonable sense. In this time there was an extreme paranoia, and I think also some people used the system to take revenge privately on people, but also the racism of the Chinese state towards its minoritized, especially Muslim population, exploded in this time and led to between 1 and 2 million people going through the camp system, and around 200,000 to 300,000 people, more than usually, being sentenced to long prison sentences and today serving prison sentences. And even though the so-called re-education camps today are largely dismantled, many have been closed, those that are left are running on much, much lower capacities than between 2017 and 2020. The repression has not stopped. The repression is still ongoing, and people who were in these camps are today extremely afraid of being put back in the camps, and they are intimidated and they are under strict surveillance, and they are forced to denounce their religion, denounce parts of their own culture, stop using their own language in many contexts in the region. And till today, the situation is very, very dire. It is getting slightly better in some areas, but it's very difficult to say how deep this betterment is. You can see it on the surface. There's no longer the same police and military presence as there was up until 2020. There are no longer the same types of surveillance as clear and as visible, checkpoints and so on and so forth. And there are a lot less people now in camps. But on the other hand, people are still being very tightly controlled. And you could say that the surveillance and the suppression has kind of moved to deeper, less visible levels. So what I just described about the mass incarceration, the surveillance and the suppression is not in question. These are well-established facts. There's been a lot of research on this, and it's very clear that this has been going on and it's still going on. The reason we cannot say so much about the situation right now is just that the Chinese government doesn't give access to researchers to the region, doesn't give access to neutral observers. And so there's a lack of evidence, but that in itself is also a type of evidence showing that things are probably not the way the Chinese government is trying to show that they are, because otherwise why would they block people from going in and having a look at it themselves? And there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of Chinese propaganda saying that things are fine, nothing happened, and so on and so forth, and they invest millions into that, which also in itself is an evidence. If things were really fine, why would they have to invest millions into saying that it was, instead of just opening up and letting people in? So we have a lot of direct evidence about what happened between 2017 and 2020. We have a little less about what's going on now, but most signs still show that even though things have gotten slightly better on some areas, the general picture is still quite bleak. And the local, especially Uyghur, but also Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Dongan, and Mongol and other populations are being forced to assimilate into Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese practices.
Okay, so you said the Chinese government are suppressing Muslim minorities in Xinjiang region, and nowadays situation in Palestine, as we all see, that China is supporting these Muslim people. And how do you think about it?
Well, one thing that's important to understand is that neither China nor most other colonial powers, including the British, the United States, and the Western powers, or the Russians, really as such have a problem with Islam or Muslims. What they do is to use Islamophobia, use the hatred against Muslims that has been established in the Christian world for a long time, that was powered by the global war on terror after the 9/11 attacks and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by the US and their allies, using that to clamp down upon, control their own local populations. They've also forcefully assimilated Mongols, who are Buddhists, like the Chinese themselves, and Tibetans, who are the same. And they don't really care about the religion. They're using it as an excuse to clamp down on their colonized populations in order to take away their land from them, take away their rights from them, and turn them into a well-disciplined labor force that can be used to produce, to create profit and not give any problems to the central government. So with that said, China is supporting the Palestinians. Well, they also have quite good relations with Israel, actually, and they're also supporting the Israelis. But in this conflict that has broken out, and the now what looks like a full-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip by the Israeli military, they have expressed support for the Palestinian people, and they have also been financing Palestinian development projects and these kinds of things, especially on the West Bank, also a bit in Gaza. But they're doing that not because they're Muslims or whatever they are, or against Muslims or anything like that, but as a part of the geopolitical game with the United States. The United States is a strong supporter of Israel, and that puts the Chinese on the other side. That puts them on the side of supporting the Palestinians. Of course, there's also a long history, because a lot of the Palestinian approaches have been slightly socialistic or communistic in approach. Hamas not, of course. They're much more Islamic or Islamist even. But there has been a cooperation between the Communist Party in China and Palestinian groups, and China sees itself as a decolonial force. China sees itself as having been colonized and being against colonization, even though what they don't recognize is that they're also at the same time themselves a colonial force. So China was in part colonized by the West. Qingdao was German, Hong Kong was British, and at some point all the Western powers went in and conquered Beijing, suppressed the so-called Boxer Rebellion, burnt down the Summer Palace in Beijing, and were part of what weakened the Qing Empire to the point of collapse. But the Qing Empire itself was a colonial power, and it had conquered big areas, including what's today Inner Mongolia, Yunnan, Gansu, Qinghai, and of course Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or East Turkestan. And so, but China doesn't recognize this as colonialism. They see themselves as fighting against colonialism, and as such, they are also, for good reason, you could say, like other people who fight against colonialism, supporting the Palestinians who were colonized by the British and then had their land given to the Israeli state, and also in subsequent wars and conflicts have had more and more of their land taken, even within that area, and being treated like second-rate citizens, very much in parallel in many ways to how the Uyghurs are being treated in China. But the Chinese support them also as part of this geopolitical game against the Americans, just like the Americans support the Uyghurs also as part of their geopolitical game against China. Of course, there are Americans who really believe that the Uyghurs should have their own state and that they're suppressed people, but most of these Republican governors who are very vocal about the Uyghur cause, they have a long history of Islamophobia, of actually not caring at all about colonized people, and especially colonized Muslim people, and they are now all supporting Israel against the Palestinian people.